Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this video we're going to talk about using input boxes in Excel VBA. What we'll cover in this video are all the basic techniques you'll need to understand how to get user input. So we'll start by talking about how to display an input box on screen and how to perform basic customization of that input box. Then we'll move on and talk to you about how you can capture the result of an input box, otherwise there's not much point in displaying one. We'll mention what happens when you cancel from an input box and how you can test whether that's happened. And finally we'll talk about some technical details about what happens when you return different data types using input boxes. So let's get started. A convenient way to ask for information in VBA is to use something called an input box, and I'm going to start by showing you how to make one of those simply appear on screen. So I've started a subroutine which is going to ask the user what their name is, and to do that I'm going to display an input box. You can either type in the word input box, or if you prefer, press Ctrl and space on the keyboard to display the IntelliSense list, and then look for the word input box in the list. Once it's highlighted, type in a space, and that will display the parameter list. And it shows you that there are 7 different parameters for an input box, but there's only one compulsory one, and it's the one called prompt. The reason you can tell it's compulsory is because it's not in square brackets. So the prompt is the instruction or the question that the user sees. I'm going to ask the user, please type in your name. Hit enter, and then all I need to do is run the subroutine to make my input box appear. And there it is. You can see where the prompt is, and if I type in my name, when I click the OK button or hit enter, the input box returns the information that has been typed in. The problem we've got at the moment, of course, though, is that the information doesn't get returned to anywhere. It's actually effectively just gone as soon as I click that OK button. So in a moment we're going to look at how we can store the information returned by an input box. But first, let's have a quick look at other things we can do to customize it. You can customize an input box in a couple of simple ways. Let's have a look back at the parameter list. If I click at the end of the line of code I've already written, type in a comma, that redisplays the parameter list and shows me that I'm on the title parameter. Now the title is what appears in the title bar of the input box. Let's have something similar like personal details. If I run the subroutine again now, we should see that personal details appears in the title instead of what was there before, which was Microsoft Excel. Another simple thing we can do is change something called the default parameter. If I give myself a little bit more space in my screen width and type in a comma at the end of the current input box, I see that I'm on the default parameter now, and this is what information appears in the input box before a user types something in. So it might be, I don't know, the default name of a person, or maybe something simple that helps the user understand what to do. So maybe I'm going to enter name here. And then finally, if I run the input box one more time, we'll see that enter name here appears as the default value for the input box. So there we go, a couple of simple ways that you can modify, customize an input box. Now let's deal with the important part, how you capture the result of an input box. So I've reverted to a slightly more simple version of the input box. I've taken away the default parameter. And what I'd like to do with this input box is when a user types in their name and clicks OK, I would like the name of the user to be entered into cell A1 on this blank worksheet. So to make that work, what we need to do is at the start of this sentence or instruction say range A1 dot value equals input box, please type in your name. Now there's one small additional problem that we need to solve here as well. If I try to move away from this line, we'll see that the VB editor indicates we have a syntax error. And the reason this is happening is because my input box now needs to enclose its arguments in a set of parentheses. It's a basic syntax rule in VBA that when in fact anything, I was going to say just an input box, but in fact when anything appears on the right hand side of an assignment operator, an equal sign, you need to enclose the parameters or the arguments in a set of parentheses. It's an awkward one to remember, but it's one of those things you just get used to. It's one of those general syntax rules of VBA. So anyway, now having done that, if we run this subroutine, we'll find that when I type in my name, if I can remember my name, there it is, Andy Gould, and either hit enter or click OK, we'll see, when I switch back into Excel, the range A1 has been populated with the value that I typed in. Now, what if you didn't want to store the result of your input box in a physical cell on the worksheet? Another convenient place to store input box results is in a variable, which is essentially a space in memory to store information while your program runs. Now we've created a complete video on how variables work, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. What I am going to do is show you that I'm going to declare a variable, I'm going to call it your name, and I'm going to store a data type called string. So dim your name as string. The reason I'm using string, by the way, is because if I look at the parameter list for my input box again, it shows me that the input box returns its data as a string. So it makes sense to match the data types. So the return value of an input box is a string, and that's going to get stored in a memory space, which can also hold a string. Now all I need to do is, instead of passing the information into the value of cell A1, replace that with a reference to my variable called your name. I'm not going to do anything more with that just for now. All I'd like to do is show you when I step through the routine that this information gets stored in my variable. A couple of simple ways I can do that. If I use the View menu, I can display something called the Locals window, and there's another trick that I can show you while we're stepping through our routine. So I'm going to press the F8 key to begin stepping through. The Locals window shows me that the your name variable currently contains an empty string, and I'll see that again if I hover the mouse over the word your name. As I step through the routine, however, when I reach the stage where I can type in my name, I'll do my own name again. When I click OK and return to the VB editor, the Locals window shows me my name is stored in the variable, and if I hover the mouse over the name of the variable, that also shows me the same thing. So that's the basics of how you get information into a variable using an input box. So now if I ever want to refer back to the information that the user had typed in, all I need to do is refer back to my variable rather than hunt for the cell in which I stored the information. So let's do something really simple like display a message box on the screen. So I'm going to show a message box which shows me a simple little welcome message, hello, and your name. So it's an incredibly simple basic system, but if I run the whole thing from start to finish and I type in my name and click OK, I'll end up seeing a welcome message using the value that I typed in earlier. So far, each time I've run my input box, I've always clicked the OK button to return its value. But what happens if you click the Cancel button on an input box instead? If I use the F8 key to step through to display my input box, I can type in my name, Andy Gould, and if I click the Cancel button, what you'll see when you return back to the VB editor, if you look in the Locals window, you'll see that the variable contains an empty string. If I hover the mouse over the variable name as well, I'll see an empty string. So essentially, when you click the Cancel button, the input box ignores anything you've typed in and returns an empty string, which means I'll see an empty message as well, hello, nothing. Same is true if I run this one again and type in my name, Andy, if instead of clicking cancel, I clicked the cross here in the top right hand corner, exactly the same thing happens. So what that means is that really you should be testing the result of your input box to make sure that the user has actually passed something in. You can do that with a really simple if statement. So just after my input box has appeared, I'm going to say if your name equals an empty string, which is double quotes and double quotes, then I'm going to display a message box which says you didn't enter a name, and I might display a VB exclamation symbol on there as well to warn the user. Finally, I'll finish off the if statement by adding an else clause and an end if, which means that if I did actually enter a name, I will still see the same message that we saw earlier. So if I run the subroutine again from start to finish, type in my name, click OK, I'll see the correct message, run it again, type in my name and click cancel, it tells me I didn't enter a name. So it's a simple, very, very simple way, in fact, to test whether your input box has returned something. And because a user always has the opportunity to click cancel, it's definitely something you should consider doing. So as one final and slightly more complex example of using input boxes, I've come back to my list of films from 2012, and we're going to write a simple system that lets the user add a new film to the end of our list. 3 input boxes, one to ask for the film name, one for the release date, and one for the length, and the values passed into those input boxes will all get stored in the correct parts of the spreadsheet. So I've already made a start on the subroutine. I've created a simple variable, which can hold a string, and used an input box to populate that variable. Then these 2 lines find the correct place on the spreadsheet and pass the value of the variable into a cell. The next job is to ask the user for the film's release date. So I'm going to declare a new variable, which will be called film date, as a date. And then, after I've asked for the film's name, I'm going to ask for film date, and I'm going to make that equal to an input box, and I'm going to type in the phrase type in the release date. And before I close the parentheses here, what I want to do is quickly point out and remind you of the fact that an input box can return a string. I mentioned this before in the parameter list. And we're trying to store this string in a variable which I've said can only store a date. Now in many programming languages this would actually cause a bit of an issue. I could not return a string into a date variable because there would be something called a data type mismatch. Now VBA is quite forgiving when it comes to things like this. As long as what I type into the input box can be converted into a date, so as long as basically what I type in looks like a date, then VBA will take care of the conversion for us automatically. VBA has a feature called Implicit Data Type Conversion. Now that's considered, in the greater world of programming, that's considered quite sloppy or lazy programming, but we can rely on this little fact to help us make our code a little bit more easy to type. So although it's technically cheating, we're going to use a string returned by the input box and store that in a date variable. What I would then need to do is make sure that I can pass that information into a cell in the spreadsheet, so active cell.offset 0, 1, so one column to the right, dot value will be equal to film date. And I should also do the same thing for the film's length as well, shouldn't I? So let's have a new variable at the top called film length, and that will store an integer, which is a type of number, a whole number. I'm going to cheat a little bit here by copying and pasting my input box line. I'm going to say film length equals input box, type in the length, and again that input box will return a string, but as long as what I type in can be converted into an integer, VBA will do that for us. The final line to write here for this first version of this routine is to, again, cheat slightly, make the cell that is 2 columns to the right equal to the film length. So there we go. Let's see if the system works. I'm going to use the F8 key to step through to begin with. So I'm going to use F8 to start stepping through. We can see the variables have their default values of an empty string, a 0 date, and a number 0 for the appropriate data types. And as I step through, we can populate. Let's see, I'm going to put gravity in. I still haven't seen it yet, but I will eventually get around to that. So the word gravity gets stored in that string variable. Now, if I type in a sensible release date, in the UK Gravity was released on the 8th of November 2013. So, as long as what I type in here can be converted into a date, we won't run into any problems. Where I would run into problems if I typed in something silly like, I don't know, elephant. I couldn't store the word elephant in a date variable, so you do have to make sure that what you type in definitely is a date, or at least can be converted into a date. So 8th of November 2013, click OK, and that works happily. Again, if I do the same for a number, if I try to type in some text here and try to store that into a number variable, that will cause problems. But as long as what I type in is a number and can be converted into that in terms of data types, I'll be absolutely fine. So the rest of the subroutine will just work as normal. All the values will get stored in the correct place, and if I switch back into Excel, I'll see that my new film has been added to the list. So there you go. There's a quick extra little bit of information for you about different data types with input boxes. You can use an input box to return data to variables which aren't just strings. Now, although this can be quite convenient to do, to store the results of an input box into different data types, it can also lead to some other potential problems. Remember when we looked at cancelling an input box earlier on, we saw that the input box returns an empty string. Now that's absolutely fine. If I begin stepping through this is absolutely fine to return an empty string to a string variable. However, if I click cancel for the film date input box instead, what's going to happen is I'm going to get a runtime error which shows me a data type mismatch. And the reason for that is I can't store an empty string in a date variable. So we're going to need to have some other solution if we want to be able to capture or handle the fact that a user might cancel from entering a date, and the same would be true for the number as well if they cancelled entering the number. So I'm going to end the subroutine at this point and then look at the solution. Now there are a couple of different solutions to this type of problem. One way, and probably the best way actually, is to use something called error handling, and we're going to cover that in a later video in much more detail. What I'd like to show you here is, rather than relying on implicit data type conversion, I'd like to show you how to use something called explicit data type conversion. So what this means is, let's focus just on the film date variable. Rather than trying to store the result of the input box immediately in the film date variable, what we're going to do is have two different versions of that variable. One which can hold a string, which I'm going to call dim str film date as string, and the other, which I'm just going to slightly rename as dat film date as a date. Now obviously we've seen the problem whereby if we return a value from an input box that doesn't fit into a date variable, we get the runtime error. So to solve that problem, we're going to use our string version of that variable, so that whatever gets returned from that input box, it will always be a string, and it can always be stored in that variable because it can contain a string. What we can do then is check if str film date equals an empty string. Then, just like we did earlier on when we were testing the result of the user's name, if they left the input box blank or they clicked cancel, we could test if it was an empty string. Now if that's true, what I would like to do is display a message to the user saying you didn't enter a valid date, and then we'll just end the subroutine at that point. So quick and simple, we'll just exit the sub. Okay, so that's what will happen if the user did not enter a valid date. The next thing we would need to do then, assuming that we pass this test and we haven't exited the subroutine, is we would want to make sure that the value stored currently in the string variable can be converted into a date variable. So to do that, we're going to make the date variable, dat film date, equal to the converted version of this string variable. Now there's a whole family of conversion functions in VBA. If you look for, in the IntelliSense list, the list of functions beginning with the letter C, there's a function that converts one data type into any other. So there's one here called cbool, which converts into boolean. There's one here called cdate, and that's the one we're going to use, convert into a date. And there are several other ones as well, cstring, c integer, and so on and so on. You will find them all in this IntelliSense list. But basically, for any data type you can store in VBA, there will be a conversion for it. So we're going to use the one called cdate, and we're going to pass into that this string variable str film date, and that will result in the string being converted into a date. So this is explicit data type conversion. We're doing it deliberately. And all that's a little bit complex, I admit, but it's the sort of thing you have to start considering if you're using different data types. If we begin stepping through this routine now, oops, one more thing I hadn't done, I haven't renamed that final reference to my film date variable. I want to refer to the date version. So the date version of my film variable will go into the cell on the spreadsheet. So one more time, let's try to step through the routine. So I'm going to look for I'm going to type in an input box, another film name. I'm going to put in gravity again just because I've got the details to hand. And then I'm going to press F8 again to set the release date, 8th November 2013. When I click OK, you can hopefully see in the locals window that the string variable contains the string 8th of November 2013. It's enclosed in double quotes, indicating that it is definitely a string. Now, my if statement finds that I did not enter an empty string, so it doesn't exit the subroutine, which means it reaches this stage where I'm going to try to convert the string into a date deliberately. And when I hit F8, you'll see that's exactly what happens. The rest of the subroutine then just works as normal. If I type in the number 90 and then carry on using F8 to step through, we'll find that the film has been added to the end of the list. Just very quickly watch what happens if I didn't enter a valid date. So if I'm just going to hit F5 to run this one. I'm going to enter gravity, click OK, but this time I'm going to click cancel for the release date. And this time, instead of seeing a runtime error, I get a nice sensible message where I can click OK and the subroutine just ends. So, it's a little bit more technical than it first appears, isn't it, using input boxes, particularly if you're trying to store values of different data types. And this is just one technique for getting around that problem. Store the result of an input box always in a string, and then you can try to convert that string into the valid data type afterwards. So, thanks for watching, hope you found the video useful. If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.